Yeah, I'll introduce you.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. This is the keynote lecture for our inaugural Master of Architecture Research Conference, also in combination with the Urban Cultures Research Cluster. And I'm really delighted to have a really exciting and dynamic researcher, academic, artist, and I suppose architectural researcher with us today, Amanda Wasielewski. And she's going to be, well, she's kind of exciting to me because she's traveled and worked in so many different places. I think when the list is New York and Amsterdam and Sweden, that immediately makes me feel quite jealous, actually. But her book is going to be the kind of focus, I think, of the talk today, really looking at the way in which maker spaces and artists are involved in the kind of gentrification process. And I imagine some of the pros and cons of that experience. So Amanda, over to you.
Thanks so much for that introduction. Without further ado, I will begin my presentation. So my talk today I've titled The New Industrial Revolution, Creativity and Urban Space in the Web 2.0 Era. And this is the subject in part of my book Made in Brooklyn, or kind of the impetus behind it. So artists have always adopted new tools and technology when they arise, but in the neighborhood of Bushwick, Brooklyn, where I was living about 10 years ago, I noticed that there was something slightly different about the way that artists were kind of occupying urban space. Of course, artist-led gentrification in New York isn't a new phenomenon. You could say it goes all the way back to the early 20th century when artists were living in the Greenwich Village neighborhood, and famously starting in the 50s in Soho in Manhattan, and then several subsequent neighborhoods. So, you know, this sort of artist-led occupation of urban space isn't necessarily a new thing, but something new seemed to be happening in Bushwick. And I had a feeling it had to do with the way that artists were using new tools and technology in how they operated within that space. And I recognized it as a model that came out of the so-called maker movement, which I will talk about and define in a bit, but hopefully some of you are already familiar with that term, which largely is connected to Silicon Valley's startup culture or tech culture. And in terms of, you know, how it operates, it's very heavily mixed in with the gig economy, which we're now familiar with in sort of all aspects of society. So many workers are now gig workers, but really creative people and artists were some of the first to operate in the emerging gig economy in the mid-zeros. So in this presentation, I'll first kind of talk about the neighborhood itself that I looked at as a case study, which I've dubbed Morgantown as sort of a subsection of what's also known as Bushwick, but it's really the industrial area that's technically north of Bushwick. And then I'll talk a little bit about the maker movement and artistic practice, so the relationship between the two. And then finally, trying to think about some of the reasons of how and why artists occupy former industrial space after the era of social media. So how does social media or the post-Web 2.0 world affect the way that artists are operating in urban space? So the neighborhood that I looked at, which I also happened to live in for several years, is technically called the East Williamsburg In-Place Industrial Park. And it has a kind of grimy history. Through much of its history, it was where a lot of the worst kind of industrial operations were pushed to. Some of the earliest buildings on that site were glue factories, which were notoriously very polluting, and nobody wanted to live near glue factories. And then sometime around in the late 19th century and early 20th century, it began to be built up with light manufacturing works. And its development was aided in part because at that time it was way out on the edge of Brooklyn. So the city, it was sort of a kind of city limit situation, but also it had this connection to the East River through Newtown Creek and what's called English Kills, which was also connected through some canalways, which is also happens to be still one of the most polluted waterways in New York City. So around that area, the building stock consists mostly of 3- and 4-story kind of daylight factories for light manufacturing, and then a lot of 1-story low-level garage type structures that were built a bit later. And the kind of industry that operated there was, sewing, print facilities. There's a cement factory, or there was a cement factory there. Lots of auto body shops and lots of food processing and packing plants. Here's another map of the area. And interestingly, just to note of that area is that you can see outlined in the kind of red dashed lines what is Bushwick proper, or technically Bushwick, and that is much more of a neighborhood where there's buildings that were purposely built as apartment blocks and some as businesses. And then just north of that is where all these factory buildings and industrial area was. And most of the workers who traditionally worked in that area were living south in Bushwick and would either walk or commute to the industrial area. So it wasn't actually an area where anybody lived for a very long time until around 1999 when, so you can see from this larger map where Williamsburg is, and then the Williamsburg Bridge connects where it says Tenement Museum across to the Lower East Side. So gentrification, or artist-led gentrification in New York, kind of flowed from Soho down the line to the Lower East Side, down through Williamsburg, where there were also a lot of industrial buildings, and then further down into Bushwick by 1999 as artists and people in need of large industrial space were being pushed out of Williamsburg around that time. So the era that I cover in the book is roughly the year 2000 to 2015. And the kind of height of which was in the mid-zeros to about 2010. So here's some pictures of some of the kind of most popular types of buildings that artists have occupied. At the top is the McKibben Lofts, which housed a lot of artists and students, and they became sort of the student/artist dormitories of the area. And then below, because this wasn't a residential area at all before around 2000, there were, very few businesses or amenities in the area. So no grocery stores, no laundromats, no restaurants. There were a few delis, for workers to get a sandwich for lunch. But other than that, there was very little. So one of the first arrivals to cater to the artist population was a small grocery store called Brooklyn's Natural, which is kind of a hipster grocery store with lots of organic produce and that sort of thing. So that was one of the first, and that was right next to the Morgan Avenue subway stop. And so a bunch of other businesses subsequently sprang up around there as well. And just to give a view of Bushwick as well, because once artists were occupying this industrial area north of Flushing Avenue, which is the northern border of Bushwick, sort of artists and other gentrifying forces began moving into the buildings beneath that, lower into moving through Bushwick. So this is very close to the industrial area, and You can see the bottom picture was from 2007 and the top is from 2016. So there you can see there's an Asian or Chinese food trading company operating out of one of the garage spaces, really common in the area, which became a health food grocery store. And then also, you know, artisanal pizzerias and that sort of thing. This is just north of Flushing, so this is in the industrial area. One of the large 4-story buildings was converted into a shopping center of boutique shops, tattoo parlor, hairstylists, you know, the sort of high-end clothing or quirky clothing boutiques. That's also within that 10-year period. And of course, like surrounding these are still industrial work. So just around the corner from here, it was a massive auto body wrecking shop, which would kind of take cars and crush them. So even though these were springing up, it was still amidst other more industrial operations. And then just one final image to demonstrate that south of Flushing, before artists and gentrifiers started moving in, it was largely a Latino neighborhood. And so you can see there were 2 Mexican delis present on this corner. And then subsequently there's a sort of high-end bar that came and a juice bar as well next to it. So there's still some remnants of these Latino businesses that existed in the neighborhood before, but they were increasingly being pushed out for more high-end gentrifier catering businesses 10 years later, 9 years later. So one of the key differences, I think, between, for instance, the occupation of this area by artists and creatives and students and other gentrifiers in the mid-zeros to the mid-10s was that very quickly it became a very expensive place to live, which is interesting because in all the sort of previous industrial gentrified neighborhoods, it took a very long time before they became expensive places to live. Soho, it took decades. Williamsburg, it took about 20 years. It happened within probably a 4 or 5 year period in Bushwick or in Morgantown. And so this was an ad circa 2015, 2014, I think, for an apartment in McKibben Lofts, and it's pegged as a penthouse, and the rent is $4,500, which one of the kind of, you know, truisms about how artists move into industrial space is that they're seeking out cheap, large spaces and are willing to sacrifice in terms of amenities, in terms of comfort. So these buildings, for instance, the McKibben Lofts, you know, they were often built up by the people who lived in them. They had basically no oversight from any kind of landlords and no maintenance. Often they were, one of the McKibben Lofts was actually still illegally occupied, even though it had been occupied for some 20 years. So those were the kind of things that artists in Soho or artists in Williamsburg in the 80s or early 90s faced. But the trade-off to that was that they got the building for extremely cheap rents. And this wasn't the case in Bushwick. So there's a kind of, the mystique of loft living had bled over, and landlords of these buildings found that they could not only not take care of the buildings, not follow zoning codes, but also that they could make enormous amounts of money from people who wanted that lifestyle in those types of buildings. So these were just a few examples gathered around 2012, 2013 from Craigslist, some apartments that were, or rooms that were for sale. So they're all illegally built inside. So there's all kinds of crazy cubby holes, very unsafe fire regulation wise, to split up the large loft spaces into these kind of tiny ladder rooms with lofted beds above them. So here's another few examples. very sort of small, no windows often. And so these were being kind of marketed as artist studios, artist live workspaces, but often not even really adequate to that task. So on a personal note, the particular building that I lived in, you can see at the top here, I lived up the ladder there. And this building, although it had been occupied for over a decade by artists, was still an illegal building. And just as I moved in, there was a process by which the city was increasingly aggressive in trying to evict us. So despite the fact I was paying basically market rates of rent for this building, it's a huge amount of money in rents, it was constantly facing eviction, and the fire department was always trying to enter the building to throw us all out on the street and lock up the building. So I wasn't there very long, as it was quite a stressful situation. And, you know, obviously you can kind of see the state of things from this picture, but, you know, their windows were not insulated. There was no heating. So this was the kind of lifestyle, I guess, that is sold to artists in the area. And, you know, unlike in previous generations, it was something that was paid a high price for. After I moved out, I still maintained a studio in the area, but instead my studio was part of a co-working space. And this is the pictures at the bottom. So you can kind of see it was a garage space that was shared by a number of people. And this was what got me thinking about the maker movement as well, because increasingly I was used to, I had lived in London for 5 years and I'd lived in Amsterdam. And I was used to a situation at that time where artists shared studios, but it was sort of a permanent kind of situation in a way. Whereas the model I was faced with moving to New York was one where, you know, we had a kind of desk situation where it was like a co-working space for office workers, but for artistic workers. And that to me, it also has been called a makerspace. So we also in this space had some equipment, though it rarely worked, that was advertised when I signed up for it, you know, that we'd have access to a 3D printer, that we'd have access to laser cutters and that sort of thing. So that was part of what made this a makerspace, was that it was supposed to be a situation where we shared equipment and space as well. So those experiences got me thinking about, you know, how artists are positioned in this neighborhood, or how they were positioned differently than I was perhaps used to in my previous experiences as entrepreneurs or makers rather than traditional artists. And one of the things I think that defined this was there was really an outward-looking entrepreneurial mindset amongst the artists that I met in the area. So there wasn't really an interest in staying, you know, within the neighborhood and building a community from there, but rather kind of growing a business as an artist. And a lot of the, I picked out a few key sites in the neighborhood that kind of were indicative of this. So you can see on the map, there's the McKibben Lofts, which were mostly living spaces, but also workspaces. Brooklyn Fireproof, Office Ops were both kind of co-working studio share spaces. Shea Bushwick was a kind of dancers co-working space. So it was a rental space where different dance groups could use the space. And then kind of hard to see, kind of mashed together in the center are the food related businesses. So Roberta's was one of the biggest ones where, you know, food and the idea of, you know, building a business around food became very important to this hipster maker culture in the area. We'll talk about in a minute. But then first I want to talk about Third Ward, which is at the top here. And Third Ward was a true maker space and kind of pioneering in the area. So it opened in 2005, and it was located in a 4-story loft building at 195 Morgan Avenue that was built in the 20s. And what it offered, it was started by two artists who moved down to New York they graduated from the School of Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. and they moved down to New York, and they were interested at first in having a space to throw kind of club nights or raves, parties with DJs, but they very quickly hit on the idea that it would be great if they could kind of build a makerspace, a shared space in this building that people would pay a membership towards, and that they could make money off of this kind of membership to the building. So at its height, Third Ward offered not only kind of shared studio spaces, not permanent studios, but shared spaces, so kind of desk spaces or co-working spaces, but also classes and workshops. And they had woodworking studios, they had jewelry making classes, they had 3D printers, they had cutters and CNC machines and stuff like that. So they had all this equipment that was shared, and people paid a membership fee for Third Ward to join. And there was also a restaurant attached. So next slide, you can see down below where the people are sitting, kind of hanging their legs off. That became like a kind of high-end restaurant as well. So there were a lot of amenities within one building offered by Third Ward. And one of the things about Jason Goodman in particular, who's pictured here, is it was kind of celebrated in the media for not having any kind of business plan. It was just pure kind of bootstraps, and entrepreneurial zeal that he was going to make this thing happen. And he had a very ambitious plan. It wasn't just having Third Ward, but it was expanding to other locations, opening a culinary school. So he had perhaps too many ambitions for what he was capable of with the business. And it kind of unceremoniously, really overnight to a big scandal, collapsed in 2013, and he disappeared. He left town. All of his employees lost all their money. All of his members lost all their money, or were not refunded. So it kind of had this big cataclysmic collapse overnight after they had done a lot of promoting to expand the business. But one of the interesting things I thought about this particular venture was the kind of philosophy behind it. So Goodman was quoted in the press with the following quote. And so I had actually, my garage studio space was around the corner from this. So I know the kind of neighbors we had, and they were, they were metal shops, and they were tortilla factories, packing and storage facilities, that sort of thing. So he said, once there was a particular neighbor who really freaked out culturally. I didn't know who it was. Every single day, the fire department was showing up, even when we were open for business during the daytime. I finally figured out who it was, and I confronted him. By the way, the fire department is who people in this area call to try to get people evicted, because everything is fire code violations, basically. So he figured out who it was and said, "What's the problem?" He literally was like, "I don't want you in this neighborhood. This is for us to do manufacturing, and we don't want you coming here and changing it." I said, "Well, you don't know what we do. We do manufacturing. We provide shop space for people who make things and have on-demand production facilities." They were sort of getting it, and then they're like, "Okay, cool, sorry." So what this says is that, on a certain level, Goodman was buying into this idea that what was going on in Third Ward wasn't hobby, it wasn't even artistic practice, but it was some sort of manufacturing that was happening, but in a different way, in a kind of innovative way. So this was also interesting to me, that this sort of philosophy moved artistic practice away from the kind of image of the solitary artist in their studio to the idea of a manufacturer who is doing production at a production facility in an industrial area. So then this sort of led to the questions, what was the effect of this? And so I delved a little bit into the history of the maker movement. And so for those that aren't aware, the maker movement began around the mid-zeros as a kind of tech-infused new DIY movement. So very largely, kind of grew out of the Wired magazine crowd and the tech industry, and revolved around the idea of small-scale production or small-scale manufacturing through digitally enabled technologies. Where this happens was initially in Silicon Valley culture, hackerspaces were places where people would kind of get together and tinker with technology and hopefully come up with something new and innovative just from messing around in a kind of free-form way. This kind of dovetails into incubators, which is where coders and programmers and developers get together and maybe a community and try to come up with startup ideas that will be disruptive technology. It bled into the office environment with the idea of co-working spaces as a kind of contingent space to work rather than a solid enclosed office space. And then the kind of combination of all these things is the maker space. So it's a place where this same kind of experimentation and tinkering and community is supposed to happen, but also with the availability of small scale production tools like 3D printer, which is a kind of patron saint of the maker movement. And the idea behind this is that by sharing digital content, like all other digital content, you could share three-dimensional digital content that could then enter the real world as objects via things like 3D printers. And this, obviously the first step towards this was things like music sharing in the 90s. And so now you have sites like Thingiverse, which, you can make your very own Yoda soap dish if you want. And you just download the models, and if you have a 3D printer, you can print it out. But also, it puts software tools in the hands of consumers rather than professionals, much in the same way that things like GarageBand or Final Cut Pro or Photoshop have done for music, film, photo producers, whereas once you needed a kind of specialist setup to do a lot of these tasks, now any sort of consumer with enough money can have access to more or less professional quality content that they make. So the idea was to do this kind of thing, but do it with physical objects in the, take digital plans and produce them in the real world. Also kind of interesting in light of the recent NFT boom and things like, the first completely digital house being sold and stuff like that. So anyway, so also this kind of dovetailed with a new interest in DIY and craft. So of course, people were always doing DIY and craft projects, but what makes this kind of movement different is the connection, the network connection to the outside world. So the kind of entrepreneurial mindset. So not only will you make your, handmade artisanal products, for your enjoyment or maybe even your community's enjoyment, but it's, you might also sell them on Etsy and reach a broader audience. So this aspect of selling online and reaching out outside the boundaries of a local community was something that kind of sets it apart. As I mentioned earlier, there's also the role of food, and from here on out, you might see a few vintage memes popping up because they were around, between 2005 and 2010, there were a lot of memes about hipsters in gentrifying neighborhoods. But food has historically played an important role. So on the bottom, you see Carol Gooden, Tina Gerard, and Gordon Matta Clark at outside the art project / restaurant they opened called Food in Soho, which was started in 1971. And similar to Bushwick, Soho didn't have really any, a lot of amenities for the people that lived there, because it was not only a manufacturing area, but it was also an area that was slated for demolition. And part of the reason that there was supposed to be a highway built straight through the middle of it. So part of the reason artists got space there cheap was because everyone figured it would soon be demolished, which it never was. But they opened this restaurant, Food, which it pioneered a lot of things in terms of what we're used to in restauranteering, now, or kind of high-end restaurant culture, including they had fresh food, which was something that in the 70s was, not having everything pre-frozen was a quite big deal at the time. But they were really community focused, so they weren't really interested in getting clients from outside the neighborhood. They were really focused on not only providing food for the artists who lived in Soho, but also providing jobs for them. So a lot of artists worked part-time there, and so it became a kind of relational art piece where artists participated, and it was seen as an artwork by these artists as well. But then in Bushwick, if you compare, there was the kind of social media push that so companies like Empire Mayonnaise, which ended up going bust fairly quickly, was widely mocked, opened in Brooklyn, and had a big social media presence, but they charged really crazy prices for their jars of mayonnaise. I think it was like $11 to $15 per bottle in 2014, 2015. And there are also things like hot sauce tasting, boutiques, which part of their nature was being promotional on social media as well. So to return to the maker movement in general, so there's all these things, the craft movement, the food movement, the 3D production, these are all part of the maker movement in various ways. But where does it really come from? Well, this guy, Dale Doherty, he coined the term Web 2.0 in 2003 when he was executive at O'Reilly Media, which is a company that makes handbooks for programmers and other things. And he coined this term as well, the maker movement, this kind of DIY culture he was seeing within a combination of electronic hacking and other tinkering that was facilitated by network culture and things like the 3D printer. And they founded Make Magazine, a magazine devoted to it, in 2005. So here's Make Magazine. And then out of this, subsequently, there were maker fairs. So there's massive fairs that promoted the movement as this kind of next big thing. Also, Chris Anderson, who was the former editor-in-chief of Wired Magazine until 2012, when he actually stepped down to run this 3D robotics company, which was a kind of maker business as well. But he labeled, and this is where the title of my talk comes from, he labeled the maker movement as the new industrial revolution. So this kind of echoes what Goodman had said about, we're doing manufacturing. And I thought it's quite interesting, this idea that you have these former industrial spaces and artists or creative people are moving in and calling themselves the new industrial revolution, calling themselves manufacturing. So there was this idea that somehow manufacturing was coming back to American city centers, which, subsequently in the sort of rhetoric of the Trump era in the US is also really interesting, because it was a long-held dream for many Americans who suffered under deindustrialization, that manufacturing would indeed come back to American urban centers. So I thought it was worthwhile looking a little bit at what this might mean in terms of, the bringing back in the Industrial Revolution. So of course, as I'm sure you're all well aware, the old Industrial Revolution was widely seen as, something that was quite difficult for most people operating under it. I mean, it, of course, precipitated rapid urbanization as manufacturing moved to machine power, but it brought with it wage slavery and hard labor conditions for children and the rest of the workforce, and including and also really heavily polluted city centers. But eventually, as workers won more rights, these were seen as good jobs, and they still are in the US today, kind of divorced from the logic of how they got to be good jobs. But deindustrialization, after deindustrialization, these areas fell largely into disuse. So you can see the bottom picture is actually where the Chicago steel mills, I'm from Chicago originally, there's the vast tract of land in the south side of the city that used to be steel mills, and is laying vacant because it's still heavily polluted. And these were the sort of steel mills that brought my Polish great-grandparents to America to work in. So one of the things that Chris Anderson says in his book Makers is, if Karl Marx were here today, his jaw would be on the floor. Talk about controlling the tools of production. You can now set factories into motion with a mouse click. So Chris Anderson is not the only one, but several promoters of the maker movement had said similar things, that suddenly what these new technology avenues were providing was actually empowerment of workers. No longer would workers be kind of enslaved to the boss, but they could be their own boss. But of course, in reality, this isn't quite the case. So still, you know, putting a factory into motion with the click of a button may make Western people the bosses, but there are still people in other parts of the world who don't have that power, and they are the people who are at the other end of that click of the mouse button. On the other hand, if you look at just the idea of 3D printing, so at the top you have MakerBot, the 3D printer maker that made a big splash about having their factory based in Brooklyn. Nobody's under the illusion that, you know, a 3D printer will allow you to do any kind of production at all, actually, prototype making. But in reality, what the 3D printer ends up being is sort of a leisure tool rather than an actual production tool. And once a lot of these people in the maker movement want to get serious about production, they all move their manufacturing to China. So you can see that, like, as a child's toy, almost, there's this kind of leisure component to the 3D printer that isn't being stated in these kind of really grand sweeping statements made by people like Anderson. So I wanted to also talk briefly about the role of the gig economy and freelance work. So part and parcel to this idea of you being able to hold the means of production is that you are solely responsible for, you know, whether you sink or swim. So there's a kind of rugged individualism at stake here, something that's celebrated across the spectrum, but particularly in the US. So this company Fiverr, which I'm sure some of you are aware of, which is a kind of gig-based creative platform, so allows people to put their skills up for sale to make websites or do logos or any number of activities. They had a big advertising campaign around 2014 that, you know, had these really sort of forceful statements about you're getting everything done yourself, and they in particular went viral in a bad way for this ad, where this kind of rather gaunt, tired-looking woman, you know, basically has no life. She has no time for eating or sleeping, but she might be a doer. So this was this idea that through the gig economy and freelance work, you are the entrepreneur. When, of course, in reality, we've seen in the subsequent years, as a lot of gig workers from Uber and various delivery biking companies are trying to gain rights as workers, that they aren't exactly the entrepreneurs that these companies have said they were. So this was a quote from the head of digital for Fiverr, kind of defending the campaign, saying, "Our campaign is all about celebrating the entrepreneurial spirit, taking action, doing what you want with your life. The campaign was born out of a large amount of research we did about who our community is comprised of and what makes up the bootstrapped entrepreneurial mindset." So again, this bootstrap entrepreneurial mindset is the goal in that. So just briefly, I wanted to play this ad as well, which is quite funny that they had at the same time. Hopefully this works.
I think it may have frozen on my screen anyway.
I think it's this, you need to have your sound settings on for video, Amanda.
Oh, sorry, did it not work? Hello?
It's just the sound hasn't come through, I don't think.
Okay. Okay, we'll skip it then. But basically the same idea that, you know, you alone are responsible for, you know, you're the one who can make things happen. You're the one who can, you know, build your entrepreneurial dream, make it big. And of course, the kind of heroes of this are people like, you know, Zuckerberg or Steve Jobs, who, of course, as a gig worker, there's no chance that people, or very little chance that people will reach those kind of heights. Instead, you know, you see this was from several years ago, but screenshot of people offering to make websites for under €5 on Fiverr at the bottom. And then, of course, the ubiquitous bike delivery jobs, which are constantly fighting for more worker protections these days. Back in 2015, New York actually tried to pass, or did pass, protections against non-payments for freelancers. But I thought this image is also really key in that, you know, often prior to COVID, the office space of the freelancer was a coffee shop because they didn't have, you know, when you don't have an employer, you're also not provided an office or equipment. So just go through this a little bit quicker. So another aspect of this was the kind of stereotype of these makers or giggers, gig workers, as hipsters. And around, you know, the mid-zeros to the mid-tens, this was a really derided stereotype. So here's some old memes making fun of hipsters. There was the stereotype that they're all rich trust fund kids who do nothing all day. There are even ads on the New York subway that said hipster is not a real job. So there was this sort of stereotype that the wealthy, gentrifying, privileged young people were just kind of lazing about. But one of the things I thought about was that, while this might be true for a few people, typically gig work doesn't look like work, or at the time maybe people were unfamiliar with what gig work actually looked like. So when they saw all these people sitting in the cafe all day, maybe they thought they were just sort of lounging about, not having a real job, but when in reality they might have been hustling for gigs on Fiverr, and sort of some of the first to experiment with this gig economy, trying to make it work in the gig economy. And so just to kind of close up with some big ideas, you know, the question remains, why do artists move into poor or disinvested areas? So the practical idea is that there's cheap and available space for making artwork. In reality, that is less and less the case. Another thought is that there's part of it is being part of an authentic culture. So neighborhoods that are disinvested tend to be less homogenous than some other areas of the city, you know, less of the same old high street stores or whatnot. So there's an idea that middle class young people seek out this quote unquote authentic culture in poor neighborhoods. But then there's also this kind of rather toxic idea about exploring the frontier. So like the kind of Wild West of urban centers, which, much like the Wild West myths of the you know, American West in the 19th century, disregard the fact that there are people who have long inhabited these neighborhoods and made lives there, apart from, you know, that's not just empty space to be claimed necessarily. And so, yeah, this image, I think, is not really a new idea, this kind of fetishization of the poor. This is a Francisco de Goya painting of the Duchess of Alba, and she's dressed, it was very fashionable at the time for wealthy aristocrats to dress as mahas, or poor women. So she's dressed in kind of folk clothing, as was fashion at the time. And if you look at the rhetoric of gentrification, there's lots of frontier imagery of breaking new ground, gold rush, and those sorts of things to consider. Some final questions. If artists' live workspaces are no longer cheap, and they give way to maker spaces or co-working spaces with membership-based models, what is this? How does this change the nature of creative work? How does this change how artists work and what kind of work they make? And then what, I think this idea of the hipster, I think subsequently now is no longer really a force in culture, but it's interesting to think about how the stereotype of the hipster was driven by this entrepreneurship, this maker culture, from the early zeros to the mid tens. And then, are these kind of maker spaces or co-working spaces in these areas really bringing back production to urban centers, or is it something else? Is it a leisure activity? Is it just an extension of the gig economy? And then there's often this rhetoric in the maker movement that everyone can be a maker. Everyone has access if they just harness their creativity. But there are limits, of course, and what factors play into whether everyone can access maker culture or maker spaces. So that is the conclusion of my talk. Thanks so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Amanda. I'll start, if I may, just by asking you, I suppose I'm really interested in the fact that your research really seemed to come out of very personal experiences. And I don't know, what do you see, is that important to you? Do you think your research always does that? Was it helpful in this project?
Yeah, I suppose in some ways, yes. It's like probably most of the research I do has some connection. I think this was probably the most personal, though, of the projects that I've done, because I lived it in a very real way. It wasn't just taken from the milieu that I was familiar with, but I lived in these spaces and I experienced this culture clash, which was really what spurred the project. Initially was the idea that I was coming from, even though I'm American, I spent kind of my education time in the UK, and then I lived in the Netherlands as an artist. So I didn't really have experience of being an artist in the US and certainly not New York. So there was this kind of culture clash of, okay, an artist is something different here, or it seems to be. And I think it's maybe an idea that has subsequently spread to other places as well. But at the time I felt like it was something different. And yeah, the people I shared a studio space with as well were working, very much because there's basically no public funding for arts, no stipends. I came from the Netherlands where, there's very, very generous artist stipends. So artists really were hustling. They were doing their projects, but they're also doing corporate projects, designing windows, doing videos to project onto new condominium developments. And I was really quite shocked by that, I guess, a bit naive about how much hustling went into being an artist in New York.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and something that you touch on later on, but maybe is linked with that is, it's noticeable that not all, but a lot of the inspirations and the images that we see are of kind of guys, is it quite a male environment, do you think, that particularly maybe linked with the makerspace?
Yeah, I think as an extension of the tech industry in general, there is actually, it's interesting, my research into the very, very beginnings of the industrial area of Bushwick, actually there were very, very few women who went to, I guess, for lack of a better word, colonize that area because it was seen as extremely dangerous, and there was no presence of, very empty streets, very kind of desolate surroundings, and often people would go there to like burn cars to collect insurance money and stuff like that, or set off fireworks, and very little police presence or anything like that. So yeah, so all the initial people who started all of the businesses in that area were all men. And I think part of the tech culture scenario as well is it was quite male dominated as well. But yeah.
Great, thank you very much. I mean, I'd really like to open questions to the floor. Are there any questions that, well, firstly, just to say that you can post those, you should be able to post those into the live Q&A chat on the side of your sidebar. So please feel free to do that, and I will try and, pass those on. But in the meantime, also, I'm just wondering if my colleagues have any questions that they'd like to start with. So maybe Gemma, did you have something that you would like to ask?
Yeah, although Alessandro has actually just put one into the chat there. He might not be able to ask it live at the moment, and then I could come on to mine afterwards. So Alessandro just asked, are you there, Alessandro? Do you want to ask it, or I can ask on your behalf if you want me to? Might not be able to speak just now.
I'm here.
Oh, you're there. Okay. Go on, over to you.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Amanda. Well, I just wanted to, for the benefit of the students as well, just if you could expand a bit on your kind of research methods or processes that you undertook to gather all the information for the book, and how you filtered all that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it was quite a different process than I tend to typically use as an academic, in that it was quite autoethnographic. So part of the research was actually my own personal experience in these spaces, but also ethnographic in the sense of the experiences of people that I was in touch with, and finding, I did a lot of interviews with people who ran the different spaces in the neighborhood. So it was quite a sociological type of methodology as well, of doing one-on-one interviews. And then I think my background is in art and architectural history. So for me, it was really important to delve into the history of the neighborhood as well. So that incorporated archival research of looking back through the kind of New York City archives of maps of the area, records of the businesses that had been there, the different kind of going through the kind of New York portal for planning permissions and violations on different buildings. So it was that kind of archival research as well. So I would say a combination of interviews, autoethnographic experience, and archival research was the main methods.
Just to clarify a little bit, could you just explain what you mean by autoethnographic?
Yeah, sure. So ethnographic research is something that comes out of anthropology originally, I think. But it's where you kind of immerse yourself in a particular environment, and so you learn or gather information from being kind of observer, participant within a certain milieu. But in my case, I was also part of that milieu, so hence it's autoethnographic in that I was not just an outside observer, I was also a participant in that world as well.
Great, thank you, really interesting. But I'm also, there's a question that's been posted into the chat from Jay Ling. I think, are you here? Are you able to ask it, Jay Ling, or do I need to? I think I need to read it out. So Jay Ling just says, thanks for the inspiring talk. She'd like to know whether you see this happening in the Eastern world at all, for example, in Beijing in China, and whether there are any differences in any of the research that you might have done subsequently.
That's a really interesting question, and I'd love to actually, I'd love to know more about the situation in Asia, particularly as industrialization progresses. And I know the maker movement has been popular all over the world, including in Asia. But I mean, I don't have any personal research experience of the Chinese situation, but I think it will be interesting to see if what happens with the industrial areas, these vast industrial areas, and is there going to be some kind of progression similar to what we've seen in the West, or will there be something different? So far, I mean, still the kind of powerhouse of manufacturing is in China and other countries in the East. So, still Western producers are looking there for, large scale production, but I think it would be really interesting to know actually, if something similar could, if there's similar like kind of gentrification of industrial spaces that happens in those scenarios as well.
Thanks. I wonder, Gemma, are you there and ready and poised to ask a question yourself?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you. Thanks, Amanda. Really enjoyed your talk, and that kind of critique is something that's just so interesting and not commonly heard it kind of so explicitly in that way. And I particularly, like this idea of the individualization of makers and the kind of issues and problems that arose from that. And how kind of candid you were about it as well, I found really interesting. But can you see kind of as the movement perhaps becomes kind of more centre ground, I suppose, really, can you see ways in which it might kind of bring more collective benefit, contrasting with that kind of, the individualization that you were talking about previously? And has there been any impact? I mean, at the moment we've all been kind of stuck at home. The situation's been so different, and people are much more focused on the idea of coming together. So can you kind of envisage a way in which maker spaces could have more of a kind of collective benefit, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I don't talk about in this presentation is how important the maker movement has been in educational settings, and as a maker spaces as educational tools, has facilitated a lot of experimentation, a lot of learning, and a lot of different forms of learning for students who maybe don't respond to kind of traditional academic oriented methods. So I think there's certainly a lot of positives, and just like the kind of the examples of the film editing or Photoshop or other things like that, I can see 3D printers being integrated into the kind of personal consumer production tools in a really useful and really valuable way. I think what my critique is focused on is the idea of let's not sort of operate under the illusion, though, that we're bringing manufacturing back, when still people are outsourcing manufacturing to other countries outside of the West. So yeah, I definitely think there's plenty of room for, both the utility of the kind of maker tools, also the community of learning that's created through maker spaces, and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you.
Any more questions from either the public audience or the private audience that are in the meeting here? Questions that you'd like to ask Amanda? I mean, I'm quite interested in the way that, particularly for students as young people, whether you see yourselves as potentially part of this movement, whether you can see a sort of architectural practice or some kind of hybrid practice that's inspired by your maker abilities as being something relevant to you?
Actually, we have got another question here, Rachel.
Great, go for it.
Okay, so I'm going to read it out, but I might have to slightly interpret it. So it says, when is a grocery store an artwork or an art project, and how did this impact on the business, and how did it produce value in the artwork? What was the status of the artwork? So I guess it's trying to kind of get to the question of the food, how those kind of things crossed over with one another, and how that kind of brought added value, and where those kind of lines blurred. What's kind of particularly interesting within that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for that particular work, it was kind of an early example of what became known as relational aesthetics or participatory art. So it's an artwork that its form is a community brought together, that sort of eating together, working together is itself the artwork, and the value that adds is in building that community. And so for them, it wasn't about making a profit. And I guess that is the key difference here, is it wasn't, we're building a business that we want to be a successful business that will last years and years and years and make lots of money. Their idea was that we wanted to build a kind of community space to share food, and to facilitate, jobs for people. And I didn't really have time to get into it, but Roberta's is this pizza place in Bushwick, and it was started by artists as well, out of a garage space with very little kind of, it wasn't set up to be a restaurant. They kind of brought in a pizza oven, and it became a very hot restaurant. But they too, unlike the people of food in the 70s, the Roberta's artists really harnessed this kind of entrepreneurial idea, and so wanted to expand in lots of different ways, and they were quite successful actually. But then were no longer practicing the various forms of art that they initially did, and they became restaurateurs, and actually opened a very high-end branch called Blanca's next door that became, Michelin star rated and that sort of thing. So there was a kind of difference in culture, a difference in intent with, artists opening a restaurant in 1971 as an artwork versus artists opening a restaurant that became a very hip, trendy place, and subsequently expanding into other ventures after that.
I think it's really interesting to kind of reflect on the nowness as well. Just hearing Gemma speaking about that kind of aspect of, if we're post-COVID or we're still during COVID, there's a lot of talk about the high street and how that's going to survive or fail, and with all of these shops closing down. And actually, there's also a counter argument that actually there'll be a regenerative cycle where rents are low, people can move in and start to do creative things. It's really interesting to think about how that will work, especially when a lot of the projects that you're talking about getting people to come together, and even some of your images of just seeing people beautifully squashed up and close to each other made me feel quite reminiscent. But I think there's a really interesting kind of reflection on high streets and the impact that it'll have, and this really challenging conflict between the fact that in a positive way it can bring life back to a high street, and some stuff can be local and engaged with, productive, perhaps even generate some local jobs, but also the fact that it gentrifies, it therefore prices loads of people out of the process. I mean, do you see this as a continuous cycle, or do you see this as actually a problem that we can somehow avoid?
I mean, I think, part of what I touched on in terms of the kind of homogeneity of, say, the high street or the more middle class suburbs in the US, where you get all the same shops and all the same chains, and so these neighborhoods that didn't bring in those chains were seen as kind of somehow more authentic. I think that idea, although can lead to gentrification, is not necessarily you know, a negative idea. But one of the things that happened with this neighborhood is that, you know, eventually lots of people who lived in the neighborhood did get pushed out, but some of them also opened their own businesses to kind of take advantage of the new influx of people, because Bushwick for many years was just losing population, losing investment, like, you know, bleeding out of that community, which was quite a poor community on the edge of Brooklyn. And then after gentrification, it became a bit of an oasis. So this neighborhood on the edge of nothing, with nothing to, you know, no reason for anyone to ever really go there if they weren't already from that area, suddenly became a destination. So restaurants like Roberta's became a destination for, you know, people from Manhattan would be coming, queuing up for hours to get a table there. So for some of the locals as well that I've, in my research, I encountered their opinions of, you know, that there were a lot of like sort of positive seen about having these destination type businesses. So it wasn't just any old, you know, high street brand and the, you know, that no one would travel for, but something that made the neighborhood a kind of. So I can see that kind of thing happening can actually, yeah, revitalize neighborhoods and, you know, bring people in. But then of course there's always the knock-on effect of once you start bringing people in, prices start going up. So you get into that cycle again. But yeah, I think possibly that's one of the kind of potentially, yeah, something that potentially could happen, I think.
Thank you. And I think Alessandro, who's kind of quite involved in makerspaces in Birmingham and linked with BCU. Alessandro, I think you've got another question as well for Amanda.
Thanks, Rachel. I don't think I've actually got this fully formed yet, but from your research and everything that you've kind of uncovered and learned, what would you, in an ideal world, what would you design, or what do you think needs to be designed to maybe avoid some of the kind of cyclical kind of pitfalls of gentrification, and what opportunities might an urban space look like as a result?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question. Yeah, of course, how that's, I mean, as something I like struggle with personally as well, because artists, I think, often feel like this, you know, you move someplace because it's cheap to live there, or, you know, you've got friends who've got a cheap space there, and then you sort of unintentionally art wash the neighborhood, or make it kind of, there's this idea that artists make, you know, certain neighborhoods amenable to other middle class people, assuming that the artist is a middle class person, to feel kind of, oh, this is a cool place, I can move here, I can live here. So there's the kind of shock troops of gentrification. The artists often are in a very difficult situation because they themselves then often get pushed out of neighborhoods once they've sort of paved the way for other people to move in. So yeah, it's a really hard question, but I think a lot of artists have tried to have a kindler, gentler way of doing it by starting community projects, or trying to be part of a community that exists in a neighborhood, rather than just kind of come in and occupy. And perhaps that needs to be more of a conscious decision, you know, if you move to a certain neighborhood as an artist, to, you know, not just, you know, plant yourself there and not talk to your neighbors, or not organize things within the community. So like, for instance, Third Ward was pretty much inaccessible to the local community, whereas they could have certainly initiated programs to kind of try to draw in local community members, or even younger people, teenagers, and that sort of thing in the community. So I think there just wasn't any consciousness to do something like that. But I think those kind of things, maybe some people would say they're superficial if they're being cynical, but I think at least that acknowledgement, or you know, that kind of, yeah, that kind of awareness of what you're doing and where you're entering into could help, perhaps.
Great, thank you.
Well, I'm really aware of time, and we always want to continue longer and more than we ever have the time available to. But I really want to thank you, Amanda, so much. Really interesting to see that kind of very engaged and personally connected research and the influence that that's ultimately had, and the idea that, you know, this piece of work that maybe some of our students are working on could ultimately become something as amazing as a, you know, a published piece of a published book, you know. But yeah, so it's really been very enjoyable and fascinating kind of discussion. So thanks so much, Amanda.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
If the people who are here can just turn on their mics for a minute and just give you a round of applause. So thank you so much for
That's okay, yes.
We have to represent everybody that's here.
Yeah.
Really
Great,
yeah,
thank
so
you.
Thanks, Amanda, and you know, we've been delighted to have you. And okay.
All right, thanks so much.
Got to say goodbye.
Okay, bye then.
Thank you, Amanda.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.